Child Messiah Greta Thunberg has finally sailed back to Europe from the United States, and the media is again falling for the fakery. Take the ABC, who's right on board, of course, with Thunberg's global warming religion. It reported that this 16-year-old Swedish sage travelled by catamaran instead of a plane to send a message that it is possible to live a sustainable lifestyle. Well, you have to be an idiot to think that sailing between the US and Europe is a sustainable way to travel, given that more than 70 million people each year want to fly back and forth. Imagine the queues at the yacht club. But even Thunberg's yacht trip was a fake, because no, it did not prove that she could travel sustainably. In fact, even the British skipper of that catamaran, Nikki Henderson, said the exact opposite. She said the trip was not about Greta or any of us travelling in the most sustainable way possible. It was for us to make the point that there isn't a sustainable way to travel yet, and there needs to be. And why wasn't Thunberg's trip sustainable? Well, Henderson helpfully explained. She'd had to fly to the US by plane to get to Thunberg's boat to sail it back. And she also had a diesel engine on the boat as backup. Diesels use diesel, carbon fuel. Now, honestly, if Thunberg had simply flown back to Europe, she'd have saved the world some emissions. It was for show. Joining me for Culture Wars, as always, is Rowan Dean, author, editor of The Spectator Australia, to which I subscribe. I urge you to as well, and presenter of Outsiders on Sunday mornings. Rowan, what is the moral to this story?
Well, the moral is that if you want to virtue signal, Andrew, people are so gullible now about the climate hoax that they will just, whatever you say, if you say you're doing something that's emissions-free and you're doing it to save the planet, people are now so idiotic and gullible and that they will just buy it regardless of looking into the facts, as you said, and the ABC, none more gullible than them. Every element of that yacht, every item of clothing that Greta is wearing, every safety piece of equipment, all relies on fossil fuels to be made, and along with all the backups and all the rest. But the bigger thing here, Andrew, is that, as you alluded to, the idea that somehow what she is doing is in any way a model for the rest of the world to follow. If you were to have your 70 million people doing their transatlantic journey by yachts every year, A, it would slow our economies down to virtually nothing. And you can imagine all the same people who are now so upset about the idea of global warming, you can imagine them standing at the docks waiting for their iPhone, their latest iPhone, which is coming 6 weeks from wherever by sea, waiting desperately for their latest whatever it is to get to them. I mean, it's laughable. And
well, those that make it, don't forget, the
exactly,
drowning rate
yes.
would be considerable.
Yeah, and the bottom line is that the entire world economy would collapse if you took the Greta Thunberg approach to travel and to moving goods around the planet. And it's ludicrous because the death toll that would follow from that would just be horrendous.
Rowan, I'm just wondering whether there's been a change of management behind her. I mean, let's not forget, this is a 16-year-old girl who's got certain mental conditions that we've noted before, would make life a little difficult for her, and very anxiety-driven disorders. She's also been on strike from her school for an awful long time. I wonder whether the school inspectors are going to come and say, oi, come back or you're pinched. But she's suddenly starting to sound a little different, you know, like she's been to some of America's most radical universities for the past few years. In the latest article, she says, and listen to this, the climate crisis is not just about the environment. She says, colonial, racist and patriarchal systems of oppression have created and fueled it. We need to dismantle them all. Rowan, where exactly is this crusade going, and who's pointing the way?
Well, it's interesting, Andrew, because at least she's being honest now. The global warming cult has always been a socialist agenda going right back to the 70s, 80s. I think it was Maurice Strong, one of the earliest UN advocates said, and they've all said this at various points along the line, it doesn't actually matter if the climate is changing or not, because this model now allows us to decapitalise the West and to have a huge transfer of wealth across to third world nations. That's what it's all been about, a socialist, communist-style agenda for the world. Now, they themselves have admitted it repeatedly. Even the Extinction Rebellion character, one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion himself, only last year said, oh, by the way, this climate thing is just the excuse. The real agenda here is, as Greta is now saying, and as many of others had said, it's about so-called decolonising the world, so that's just code for getting rid of capitalism around the world. The patriarchy, that's just another term for basically the West. And it's a radical communist socialist agenda. After the collapse of the Berlin Wall, they could no longer sell it on an economic basis, so they're now trying to sell socialism on an environmental basis, and she is really just mouthing what is being taught to her. Don't forget her parents, her father in particular, is a radical neo-Marxist. She's just spouting what she's been brought up with, and this goes to the heart of the problem with the whole Greta Thunberg thing. In my opinion, it's child abuse. This girl has been abused. She admits to having spent much of her childhood sitting in her bedroom, starving herself because she was so depressed. No child should ever go through that. No child should ever go through that, and whatever has been put into this girl's head is shameful.
I think it's the most extraordinary story, and I'm just shocked that so few journalists call it out. What they're seeing here, it's just well, maddening. Rowan, just reported by the Australian newspaper this afternoon, Australia's biggest youth gender clinic wants to start surgery on teenage girls under the age of 17, including removing their breasts, for instance, to turn girls into boys. Now, this clinic at the Royal Children's Hospital also wants to lock in long-term funding so that any new government that comes in, they can't cut it. And it's denying media requests for basic data on what it's doing with children. Your response?
Well, I just mentioned child abuse, but the child abuse of Greta Thunberg, the mental child abuse, if you like, pales into absolute insignificance compared to the child abuse that is being trotted out in the name of transgenderism. Now, the first thing to say is, of course, there are genuine cases of gender dysphoria, and there are many cases of people who feel they were trapped in the wrong body and the only way out for them has been to transition. But that's a whole different game to what is happening around the world or around the West, where we're stupid enough to follow this mad ideology, is that you're having younger and younger kids basically transitioning for all sorts of psychological reasons. And the horrific thing is this clinic is pushing to allow children under the age of 17 to have surgery, so girls to have their breasts removed. But they're also saying, Andrew, that the child themselves is better equipped than a clinician, a psychiatrist or a psychologist to decide whether they have gender dysphoria. So this is a clinic that goes around basically wanting to remove children's genitalia and parts of their body, and they're saying that only the child is qualified to make the decision whether to go ahead with this surgery. This, I reckon, and I've said it before, Andrew, on your show, there will be a royal commission into this horrific, grotesque abuse of children, and I would be urging people to write down the names of the sorts of characters who are urging it. Exactly.
Take down the evidence.
Absolutely.
Rowan, it'll be like the eugenics movement. Once very hot in intellectual circles, now shameful in the eyes of most civilised people. Rowan Dean, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.